Now, I happen to think that to a certain extent they have a point, but they may have took it too far. I think that when they say that the battle of good and of light and darkness goes through each individual, I think it's true to a certain, but I don't think we can also discount that you have groups that may be more susceptible to the message of peace and freedom and salvation than others. And towards establishing that idea, I want to point to the parable of the sower in the Gospels, where Jesus is talking about this parable of a guy who is sowing these seeds around, and they're falling on the ground. And he's talking, of course, in the parable, the seed is the Word of God, and the fruit is the God's kingdom. And he talks about the seed falling on rocky ground, where it takes root a little bit, grows, but then it dies right away because there's not enough soil for the roots. Then you've fallen on thorny grounds, and it just gets eaten by the birds, something like that, because it gets consumed in the thorns. But the seed that falls on fertile ground bears fruit. Now, you can take this parable many ways, but the point is that there has to be, yes, each individual has the potential to receive, the light of God within them, and there's some truth to that. But not everybody is as fully prepared to do so or has the fertile ground to do so equally. And I want to suggest sometimes your cultural beliefs and ideas and conditioned ideology might sometimes be a factor in whether or not there is fertile ground for the seed to fall or whether or not there is rocky ground. And this is, in particularly, I want to talk about the notion of whether or not the ground is fertile everywhere equally to receive the idea of peace. Because in this particular example, we're talking about the idea of peace. And the Quakers thought is they didn't need to defend themselves, that peace was possible simply by preaching, the light of Christ within you, and that this time that we're going to overcome all these. Well, there's a book by Donald Kagan. Donald Kagan is a classical scholar. I believe he's Jewish. I think he's a secular Jew, but I'm not sure. But he's a Jewish classical scholar, and he wrote a book called The Origins of War and the Preservation of Peace, I think it's called. And he talked about that it is only recently where we believe that we can set up these institutions and create this idea of peace. Throughout most of human history, war was considered natural. And there was the idea that you would even, consider war to be something to avoid. It was not understandable in most cultures throughout most of history. He quotes Heraclitus. Heraclitus was a famous Greek philosopher that was prior to Plato and Socrates. He says, "We must know that war is common to all, and strife is justice, and all things come into being necessarily through strife." Then you have Sun Tzu, who is a famous Chinese philosopher. "The art of war is of vital importance to the state. It is a fact, a matter of life and death, a road to safety or to ruin. Hence, it is a subject of inquiry which can of no account be neglected." Now, in this book, he's studying various wars throughout history: the Peloponnesian War, the Roman War against Carthage, the World War I, World War II, all these various wars, and he's studying the history of what historians and classical thinkers have written about war. And so why does war arise? Why do you have war? And he comes to the conclusion, war arises from the attempt to assert one's will. Sun Tzu and many other philosophers have made the comment that war is politics by another means. So war is a natural avenue or vehicle that peoples and nations and groups of people use to assert their will, or to acquire property, or to, many for one reason or another. The idea, it's as natural as a spring storm in most people's views. Now, today, we have this idea that war is something to be avoided and peace is something that we should strive for. But throughout most of human history, that would have been considered insanely naive, you know, and actually counter to the martial virtues, the virtues of the hero, the guy who goes out, the warrior ethos, you know, which was a very strong part of ancient pagan culture, which I'll get into that in a minute. They weren't too happy when this virtue was undermined by the Christian worldview. And so Dr. Kagan in his conclusion says, how did we get to this war is natural, it's a part of human striving, like a human, and war is something to be avoided and peace is something to be obtained. And Dr. Kagan says, well, it came about because of the rise of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and particularly the teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. Now, as Christianity became the source of a dominant culture and the idea spread, these ideas spread with it. And then even when Christianity's influence waned, in secularism, they kept some of these views. So you have a secular view of what is Christian origin of this peace, peace, peace. And so he doesn't explain why this is so, but I want to go into a interpretation of my own, why I think this is so. The martial virtues, or the cause of war, is tied up with the martial virtues, the assertion of the self. Friedrich Nietzsche, who was a famous German philosopher at the turn of the century, had this famous saying that all of human striving is driven by a will to power. Now, he wasn't saying this in a negative sense. It's a good thing. And that's why he didn't like Christianity, because it turned these virtues and values on his head. In Christianity, he who seeks, I mean, we've talked about this before, he who seeks to gain his life shall lose it, and he who seeks to lose his life shall gain it. So it is the inverse of self-assertion, that you succeed by self-denial and by denying yourself and becoming a vehicle for God's presence. So you're able to accomplish supernatural things, but only through the self-denial. So it is the opposite of self-assertion. And so if war is brought about by the assertion of will, then a value system that takes the assertion of will and replaces it with the value of self-denial is going to mitigate war and strive for peace. And this was understood by Christianity's critics. At the time when Christianity was coming into its being, you know, into influence in the Roman Empire, and it's growing up and becoming more and more influential. Eventually, it caught, you know, so much so that the emperor decides to make Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. But during the time it's becoming more influential, there's arguments. And some of the pagan philosophers at the time were arguing against Christianity for this very reason, because it inverted the pagan value system that championed the warrior ethos, the martial values. And they considered the Christian teaching of love thy neighbor and pray for your, you know, and turn the other cheek, to be a perversion of the martial virtues, and the reason why Rome now was weakened and being overrun by the barbarians, because they had this mentality of loving your neighbor, this growing up, and so the martial virtues are being destroyed, and that's why Rome was taken over by its enemies. It was no longer capable of defending itself because this new value system was brought about. So Augustine's whole book, The City of God, is meant to refute this notion. And it's a really big, thick book. But basically, he gives, in this book, he's giving almost a theory of history from the Bible. He starts out from the creation, goes through Cain and Abel, and he creates a theory of history. And he talks about the rise and fall of civilizations. He talks about the causes for them, and the city of man versus the city of God coming from Cain and Abel. And it's a fascinating book.